Okay, so we're trying to make a space for us to think about humility in a somewhat different way than we've come across so far. And we're going to present an empirical study, a small empirical study compared to the ones we've been seeing in the last few days, about openness and engagement. And we're going to talk a little bit about thinking about the relationship between self and knowing. So we're coming from a different perspective. I'm coming from a different perspective particularly because I've never worked with adults. I've only ever worked with infants. And what I've been doing, human infants, and what I've been doing with human infants so far is been focusing on trying to understand infant understanding of the other person through looking at the way in which they engage with adults, the way in which they connect with adults. And in order to do that, it involves a lot of microanalyses of brief moments of connection and engagement and so on. A lot of this infant work is looking at understanding in action between infants and adults, and it's looking at understanding long before reflection. So I'm even talking about infants in the first 2 months of age. So this is my first talk ever in my entire life where I've progressed from talking about infants to talking about adults. So it's a bit of a jump to adulthood. And so for Guy, who's sitting over there, who said he thought I was probably just going to talk about adults dressed up in infant clothes, or the other way around, that's kind of what I'm not going to do, I don't think. Okay, so what we're doing here is puzzling about humility. This is actually quite confusing because I can't see the title of my slide. Who was it? Oh, could you just put it back to kind of normal so I know what I'm doing? Okay, so what we're puzzling about humility is, what is it really? How does it manifest itself in everyday life? And what does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it look like in action? Okay, I shouldn't have asked you to If you just go to that mode there. You like that, kid, huh? Okay. So we're trying to get to grips with this concept in the literature, and we've been struck by two sorts of things. One is by a kind of a focus on thought, and it's kind of easy to understand why, when we're talking about humility, we are focusing on people's attitudes towards ideas. So mostly the literature on humility is dealing with humility as an accuracy of evaluation of the self in relation to something else. And it's also, if it's not dealing with the accuracy of the evaluation, it's dealing with an attitude towards the self and the self's knowledge. So it kind of made me wonder at one point, do you remember that Jonathan Haidt and his argument about the emotional dog being wagged unreasonably by its rational tail? And I'm thinking, is something like that going on here, that I'm not getting a feeling of what humility, the emotional experience of humility is like? So that was one thing, a kind of a focus on thought. The other thing that was a little bit puzzling was a focus on the inside. And this is something that's been brought up by a few people in the last few days. Should we be thinking primarily about humility as a trait, or even as a state, but in either case as an attribute, as an attribute of a person, inside the person? Or should we be looking in some way, as was brought up, I think, by Christine Helmer yesterday, as something that goes on between people? It can't be located here, it's kind of located in the mystical spaces between, but they don't have to be really mystical. So approaches to humility, I don't know whether we really need to go into this in such detail. Moving away from the idea of humility as self-abasement and low self-esteem, more or less everyone concurs that humility is something very positive, and that it is not bad evaluation of self, but accurate evaluation of self. So if you look at June Tangney's criteria for humility, just remember these for a moment. The reason I'm asking you to remember this is as follows. I'm going to try and compare them in a minute to what we thought of as criteria for engagement. So just remember these. They talk about accurate assessment of own abilities and achievements, ability to acknowledge mistakes. We've heard a lot about that the last few days. Openness to learning from new and contradictory information and advice. Ability to see oneself in perspective as one small thing in a large place. A relatively low self-focus, and this interesting thing called unselving. Other approaches to humility, again, we've heard a lot about this before from Samuelson et al., talking about intellectual humility in particular, again, about this accuracy, that you have an evaluation which is somewhere between too much and too little. And there are some relational approaches, I'm not so sure whether we've had them here today, about looking at humility varying between whether you're talking to a friend or a stranger. So it's kind of, there has been an approach to thinking about this relationally, but I'm still kind of getting the feeling that we're not understanding what it feels like, this humility. What does it feel like when we meet it? Okay, so in the literature, again, there are emerging discussions focus on two types of interactions between in very non-humble domains, in the medical profession and in professions dealing with other cultures. And both of them kind of seem to argue humility is rare, but is desirable, and narrative humility. Humility has to involve something like recognizing that the other is different and that the other's story is owned by the other, but in approaching the other, you have to co-write that story, which is an interesting kind of twist. Not just say, this is you and I'm different and I recognize you and respect you, but something in what you're doing and what you're being, I am helping you to be. Okay? This is kind of an interesting twist. And I think both of these involve something about the way we see the other person, and both of them involve participatoriness. So we're arguing for three shifts of focus in terms of talking about humility as engagement. One is the relational, so away from the inside, away from the self, towards the relation between persons as persons or subjects. The other is the ordinary, starting to look for humility in everyday ordinary things rather than just in the specific domains that we're used to thinking of this term. And the third thing is a kind of a participatory knowing, something to do with a different conception of knowing in relation to self. Okay, what we tried to do is list some criteria for engagement. I'm going to go through this one at a time. So just put them up there to show you. I've got 6 criteria, and the thing that came up from this for us was an incredible amount of overlap and fuzziness between what constituted engagement. How do you know when you're engaging with someone, right? What is it? What is it that strikes you? You know it when you see it. All right, let's put it into words. Let's kind of pull out these examples, and that's what we try to do. But then when you look at them and you look at these criteria for humility, I'm scratching my head thinking, okay, I don't know where the boundary between one ends and the other begins. I don't know whether it's an overlap. I don't know whether it's a causal relationship between the one and the other. I don't know, which is one of the things that we're going to try and conclude, is as to whether these things are constructs which are culturally framed by particular situations, and we use one word when it suits us and the other word when it suits us differently. Okay, let's go to these 6 criteria. Seeing the other as a person. I'm using this term very much as in a Buberian I-thou sense, so where you see the other, even if momentarily, and almost always only momentarily, as a thou, as a you, as a person, as a subject, not an object. Well, what does it mean to see a person as an object? Well, one obvious way of thinking of people as objects is to categorize them. I can say, oh, those philosophers, right? Did I say this yesterday in public? Nobody heard me, right? No. Well, it's this John Cleese, my brain hurts phenomenon, right? Those philosophers, I don't have to listen to them, they're always going on about this, that, and the other. Or you meet a student on the stairs, for instance, you don't even bother sometimes to look at the student to greet them, not because you're a horrible person, not because you're arrogant particularly, but you've categorized that student as a student and haven't seen the necessity to greet them. After you pass, you realize that that student was looking hopefully and expectantly at you, and you think, damn, I should have said hello, okay? Or very pertinent to Britain at the moment, we've just had general elections, disastrous general elections from a personal point of view, although I'm willing to be proved wrong because I'm not an intellectually arrogant person. A Tory comes to the door, a Conservative Party person comes to the door. What you see is not a person. You see somebody who's full of injustice and no respect for fairness or equality of opportunity. You do not see a person. You actually just see this kind of, through a filter of all sorts of categorizations. People in medical profession, absolutely rife examples of not seeing the person as persons. I want to talk a little bit about an example from Anna Karenina, which I find, I don't know why, but I find that it moves me a lot. So this is right at the beginning of the affair, for those who don't know the story, where nobody is really clear what's going on. It isn't even an affair as yet. And they both go to a party, Karenin and his wife. She spends a little bit rather too much time talking to this handsome young guy who's attending to her. I mean, he's, And see, how come the women giggle? Karenin kind of notices other people looking at them, and he completely trusts his wonderful, courteous, responsible, beautiful wife, notices other people looking at them and thinks, oh, I must tell her not to spend so much time talking to irrelevant men. So he comes back home early because she's going to come back later. And he's thinking about how he should put it and whether he should say anything to her because he trusts her so completely. And while he's thinking about this, for the first time, he comes across a flash, an image. He vividly conjured up her personal life, her thoughts, her wishes, and the idea that she might, even must have a personal life, because he was in doubt, all of her own, was so frightening that he hastened to drive it away. This was the chasm into which he dared not look. So what he was afraid of here was of Anna as a subject, okay? And it's not so black and white. So he does this, he puts away her as a subject, she comes in, he gently starts to broach the topic of how she must be a little bit more circumspect. She, blasé, decides not to engage. Oh, what do you mean? I don't know what you mean. And he immediately, for a person who's denying her subjectivity, recognizes her disengagement with his concern as being something else. Right? It's not a black and white thing. This thing about arrogantly dismissing her subjectivity could nonetheless go with actually being ultra sensitive to it. And it's the same Anna, wonderful Anna, who at another point, a few minutes later, decides to dismiss him as, oh, he's just cold and unfeeling. Okay? So she doesn't see him as a personality, as a mutuality and a secularity. And I suspect if every one of us reflects on our own lives, think of somebody, a sibling, a partner, a kid, whom you've had endless arguments with and they go around in circles. What do you do? The only thing you can do to survive is stop seeing them as people sometimes, right? I mean, it's not a great solution, but it is a fundamentally widespread solution. And the thing is, that also is a kind of an arrogance. It's kind of putting the other person into a category and not seeing them. Okay, I'm going to have to go quite fast. One more thing I actually really wanted to talk a lot about is you can't engage with somebody without being involved. This comes back very much to Johannes' talk yesterday, or a little bit to Johannes' talk yesterday, is that I can't connect with you unless I somehow, in this moment, put myself on the line in relating to you, right? I have to be kind of open in a way that I could be threatened, I could be knocked down, but if I'm not putting myself on the line, getting in there, relating to you in a way that threatens me, makes me vulnerable, I can't actually connect with you. And there's many, many instances where you probably remember conversations galore, where you're talking with somebody who's reading a script, you know, like, oh, don't talk about telephone things where you phone and you complain about your computer and they go on and on and on, not really listening to you. Genuine involvement then, and this comes back to a huge set of questions about what the hell is genuineness. Genuine involvement requires some degree of honest expression of the self. You've got to be there. You can't pretend while you're there and still really engage. You have to be present to the other person as a person yourself in order to see the other, in order to draw the other out as a person. Although you've got to be careful. And there's a necessary circularity. If you aren't there, the other person doesn't get there. Lots and lots and lots of examples I can think of. You do something embarrassing. Let's say you fart at a lunch table. Right? What do? Okay, this is not an intellectual thing. You're trying to avoid acknowledging error, but most of the time, well, it has happened to me, and what I do is pretend it didn't happen. Now, what does that do? It creates some kind of a bound. Shut up, guy. It took a lot of risk. Okay, it took a lot of courage for me to actually say he's off. It creates barriers between you and the other, because what is done is this pretending that some untruth within the relation is actually the person going to think, oh, this person is a regular farter, they're obviously experienced at, and so on and so forth. Other things, you go for a holiday with a friend, they take you to this place which they really love, you find it very kitsch and twee, they ask you, oh, haven't you had a wonderful time? What do? Okay? You can't be too honest because it's damaging. You deny it completely and you be polite in the British sort of way. And what you've then set up is actually an arrogance on your own part, because what you're doing is you're going to go away thinking, I got out of that, my God, they have bad taste, right? Whereas if you hadn't done that, if you had actually put yourself a little bit on the line and said, yeah, I know, but, right? There might have been a possibility for some kind of connection and for further discussion and change on both parts, etc. Rolling eyes. Any of you experienced kids rolling eyes? Or kids, teenagers particularly, saying, in Britain they do this thing called whatever. Do you know that one? You do? I can't. I don't know. Some guy would know, but never mind. It's basically, if you tell them something, they get fed up with you. He's young, that's why. They get fed up with you and they say, oh, whatever. And now that whatever, when you're trying to put yourself on the line, is an utter dismissal of you, because you're trying to, it's a dismissal of engagement. Okay, not focusing on the self. I have no idea how I'm doing for time. I'm going to have to stop with you. A few minutes?
No, 20 minutes.
Okay, that's good. This is including the questions?
Well, I'll give you an extra 5 because
okay.
we're 5 minutes.
All right, so I'll stop in about 5 minutes, so we'll be all right. A blurred distinction between a self and other exists sometimes. Now, there's this lovely paper by Gaiman Metcalf where they talk about how you lose the self-other boundaries when you're really utterly inside. It doesn't last for very long. But it could be in a relation with a beach, it could be a relation with a sunset, it could be a relation with a person, right? But they argue that there's different kinds of awareness of the other as a person. In relation and outside of relation. If there's in relation, they call it something like an ecological awareness of the other, whereas a kind of a more objective awareness of the attributes of the other, if you're kind of standing outside and looking at the other person in observation. Sometimes it's easy and fluent and harmonious and it's wonderful. Ever had a conversation, rare perhaps, sometimes with some people, where you're not quite sure what you think, you have a thought, you're trying to express a very, very half-baked thought, they pick it up, they build it, they catch on immediately. That makes you think a further thought, and it goes somewhere, and it's amazing. But what's happening in situations like that is you're not denying yourself, you're very, very aware of being, because it's your thoughts you want to kind of crystallize, right? But you're also you're very aware of the space within which you can be, the space of trust and understanding or whatever it is that you can be. But you're not focused on yourself as a self, you're not focused on the other as the other. You're focused on taking that somewhere else within this space. Okay. Well, sometimes it's easy. Not thinking about yourself is easy. Most of the time, it isn't easy. In situations, for example, where this horrible, there's a Jeremy Kyle show in Britain. It's really, really, I don't know why I watch it. I'm really lousy, actually. I don't really watch it. I watch it sometimes. Well, I watch it twice, or maybe 3 times. But he does this thing of bringing together families and conflict with each other. So this particular case, it was horrifying. Girl and her mother accusing daughter, teenager, of stealing her jewelry, like lots of violent, aggressive, horribleness between them. Another sibling on the way. Jeremy Kyle has discovered that the girl had been abused by the husband before in her childhood. Girl doesn't know Jeremy's going to reveal it to the entire universe. He does. So she bursts into sobs. Mother, of course, in a huge self-protective way, pretends not to know anything, not to see that sorrow, not to see that grief, not to acknowledge it, right? And continues to focus on, but it was my jewelry and she shouldn't have done it. And this is a kind of an extreme case, and there might be other cases much more familiar to us where we're trying to protect in some way very shaky beliefs that we have. Our faith, for instance, faiths perhaps, our status. You know, I'm a lecturer, I should be knowing this, or the competence that we're supposed to have when we're talking about it. And it's not very different. This shutting out of this focusing on the self and its boundaries rather than what the other, rather than on something like the truth or something like a goal that we are both trying to reach. Leaving the door to dialogue open. Well, I had a funny incident with a philosopher. It was not me, not you, where the person approached, making a radical position, said something like, here's my position. It's completely uncommon, non-mainstream. You might not like it, but here's the position. And I know, before you say anything, there's 4 possible objections you can make. I know what they are, and I know all the answers to all of them. And I was, of course, bristling with arrogant sort. I mean, he or she is a very nice person, actually, but in that moment it felt horribly like, you just go do something to yourself. So of course I dismissed this person as an arrogant kind of, at least in that moment, in that expression. So then subsequently, so I was writing about this, and subsequently I told another philosopher friend, the philosopher said, analytic philosophers, one of the things that they are trained to do is to actually put themselves out in as extreme a position so that you can knock it down. And I'm thinking, you know, it sounds a bit trivial, but it was really like a mind-blowing shift. So instead of being the one who was the victim of somebody else's arrogance, I was actually doing the reverse. You also have institutional arrogance and monologism, absence of dialogue, juries, academic panels. You get somebody in to examine them, to have an oral, to discuss their views. You sit around, the person you said, can you go out now for 10 minutes, please, and then we'll discuss it and let you know. And I had an experience recently where it was absolutely foul. As a student was going out, I felt this kind of cringing embarrassment of what we were doing to her, of knowing that she's going out and we're going to talk. And it was a bit problematic, so we were going to talk about her. And the thing is, what do? You are part of this framework in which you are doing stuff by shutting a door to dialogue, because if the person comes in, okay, they can ask questions, but you're not really having dialogue, you've shut your door. And there's many, many different ways in which you can do this. You can deliver judgments, not actually discussing them, but saying, I think you're very such and such, not are you. You can do it in posture, you can do it in kind of powerful speech, assertiveness without doing the woman thing. Does this make sense? Do you agree? It's such and such, isn't it? Which, you know, I understand that's called powerless speech. That's a very useful dialogic device. Appreciating value, not is the fifth one I was going to talk about. Not thinking about the other in a whole way, rose-tinted or negative, both of which are not actually respecting or seeing the person. You can't, you know, seeing the troublesome student as only troublesome or the wonderful lover as only wonderful. Both of them are kind of denying the other. And accepting difference, right? You need to accept difference for dialogue and engagement. You can't see the other person as another I. You have to see the other as different. And this is certainly with infancy, it's the same as well. So humility and engagement, hard to draw the line between them. What you might call them often could be a matter of situational framing, when there are status differentials or conflicts, etc. Neither in one person, nor only in the situation, but also sometimes changing within the flux of one single conversation, right? A joke makes you break down and connect. They say something else, you bristle and come up, and so on, and so on, and so on. And over to Clare.
Okay, I originally was going to talk about all the empirical quantitative data for this talk, but I rewrote it yesterday to take most of what took all of it out. And what I really want to do is to just pull out a couple of aspects to support some of what Vasu's just been talking about. So we did a very large study in the sense that we got England, Spain and India involved in it. We were mainly looking at students and academic staff, and we were looking at how openness, emotional openness may be related to humility. We've devised a humility scale because that's what you do. And it didn't work very well, but we also put in emotional openness items. Those items correlated strongly with humility, and we found remarkably, because we also looked at the big 5 personality factors, pretty much exactly what everybody else has been finding and we've been hearing about. What was interesting though, is there was no strong differences between countries. And what we also did, and this was the qualitative part, is we asked a series of questions of people to write descriptions of situations where they've seen people being humble, or they themselves were humble, or they themselves were emotionally open, or arrogant, or emotionally closed. And so we have many, many hundreds, in fact, of examples of this. And that's what I'm going to talk about today briefly. Now, the thing about it is, even and particularly in the qualitative descriptions, we did not get any strong cultural differences. Sometimes there is clues that they're Spanish, or clues that they're English, or clues that they were Indian, but apart if you've got an independent code, they wouldn't know where these examples were coming from. And they were very much everyday examples, but in all fairness, that's what we asked for. So you tend to get if you're going to ask for it. So I want to give you a little bit of a flavour. So describe a situation where someone you know showed intellectual humility. So this was one example. A guest lecturer came to give a seminar on educational psychology. This person has a PhD, many years of experience, and has written many articles and books. During the seminar, she gave ultimate respect to everyone who asked questions and gave suggestions. Despite being so well educated, she did not act and speak like she knew everything. She was open to any queries during and after the seminar and did not show off about her qualifications and achievements. She did not make us feel incapable, even though we were inexperienced in the field. Another example, one of the professors who taught me in my master's often says in class or in public talks that he learns much more from his students than he is able to teach them. Knowing how much he's taught me, I have trouble believing this can be true, but he does mean it. He's one of the most intellectually open and curious people I know, always ready to let himself be surprised by new ideas and ways of looking at the world. A tenured professor, now you might have noticed a lot of these are about the professors. This is true of the sample. We had students and professors, and because of the power differential, when it came to humility, it was mainly about students talking about professors. Emotional arrogance, there's lots of academics talking about other academics. That's just a funny we found. Anyway, a professor I know, at an international conference and in front of his peers, openly admitted that he didn't understand a fairly straightforward method for presenting data that the speaker had used, stem and leaf plots. That took some guts, I thought, but he also qualified it by saying he was a tenured professor and therefore was able to ask stupid questions. Okay, we also asked them to describe a humble person. So what do you think are the characteristics? I would describe them as wise, not caring what other people think, kind and truly smart. We haven't heard a lot of kindness came through very strongly in our data. Sober, now I don't think they meant as opposed to being drunk, but anyway. Patient, grounded, humble, good listeners, non-judgmental. Calm, concerned, reachable, again this idea of openness. They will be very humble and kind. They will treat everyone equal to them and not superior or inferior. Genuine, honest, trustworthy, kind, respectful, clever, down to earth, etc. So you see a range of comments, but there is still sort of quite a lot of overlap when I could give you the whole pie charts of all the words, but I'm not going to. Because there are a couple of points I want to make. When you ask people for everyday situations, surprise, surprise, they come up with everyday situations. There are lots of them. There were certainly some trait descriptions as well. They couldn't think of an example of a specific situation, so they talked about that professor who's always lovely and jubbly and always kind and nice and everything. Nearly 100% were social descriptions. All of them were about me interacting with somebody else, how I felt, how I was made to feel, etc. So they were in social situations. There was no situation of anybody sitting thinking, I'm thinking how humble I am. Not surprisingly, because that's a very odd thing to be doing, but they were all social. And approximately 50% included emotional openness to the other. Now there are two things about that. Firstly, that's great for our hypothesis that emotional openness has some strong relationship with it. But we did have those emotional items in the questionnaire, and it may have acted as a prime. So because they filled the questionnaire in first, before they got the academic questions, they may have been primed to relate the two. So that would have to be replicated. Now, Vasudevi has discussed this relationship fast and very fully about the other. So I'd like to now briefly explore, very briefly explore, another relationship, and that's very briefly our relationship with the knowledge. Knowledge as a possession. We have this knowledge. I'll start again. Not as a separate entity, but as an integral part of the self. This knowledge isn't like a car that we possess and drive and leave on the street. We may love that car, but it's on the street. This knowledge is very central to the self. It's often integrated into the self, and sometimes it becomes a treasured aspect of our identity. So it is not carbon neutral in that sense. It's not totally neutral. It has issues connected to it. So owning and knowing and owning its limitations by necessity can also mean knowing and owning the limitations of ourselves. And this comes in to where perhaps emotions become inflamed. So this can be profoundly scary and threatening in different situations and in different circumstances regarding different aspects of knowledge. So we can have this very strong emotional attachment to the knowledge. So humility may be as much about losing that emotional attachment to that knowledge as it is about owning the intellectual limitations of it. Now, we've heard Christine talk about yesterday, one way religions can seek to lessen that emotional attachment is by actually reducing the self, or obliterating it if you're Teresa Revel. But also in Buddhism, it's the idea of letting go of the self, a letting go, but reducing that idea of self. However, I can't see getting rid of the self as a way forward for most academics, or indeed most students. So we can also try, and we've heard some people talk about excellent research looking at this as well, highlighting the intellectual limitations. However, the problem with that is, remember that highlighting these intellectual limitations is also going to connect with emotionally distressing aspects of the self. So if you're not just saying, this information is limited, I can hear that as I'm wrong, or I'm inadequate, or I am stupid, or I'm less than you, I'm not wanted here, or all sorts of other interpretations, because it is myself that I may see as being attacked. So it can be distressing, because, especially if it's central features of the identity. So I was thinking about, is there an alternative where we can keep our passion for knowledge? Because most of us don't want to destroy the self, but we also don't want to destroy that emotional attachment. We're academics because we love knowledge. If we didn't love it, we're strange people for being here and really focusing on it. So how can we keep that passion and ourself without getting rid of it, and yet remain humble? And a very quick diversion to Peter Timmins. Peter Timmins, I used to, as a great 4-year-old, have to walk up a very steep hill to kindergarten, which is play school or play centre, I'm not sure what it's called in America. And my mother had just had my kid sister, and she couldn't drive me or walk with me, so I had to walk by myself if I wanted to go. I very much wanted to go. However, I was very scared about walking up this big steep hill to get to my kindergarten and walk home again as a 4-year-old. Peter was 7. Peter was 7, and as far as I was concerned, he knew everything. And he wasn't scared, and he certainly wasn't humble. But he made me feel safe. So he would walk with me up to kindy, and he would come and get me when I came back home from kindy. Now, I had 4 older siblings who thought Peter was ridiculous, and I was teased. When I say I was teased, I mean it hasn't ever really stopped. My family still tease me about Peter. There were 2 more siblings to be born after my kid sister, and even though they hadn't even been born, they still teased me about Peter, because they thought he was totally silly and an absolute embarrassment. The good thing about that is I didn't care, and the reason I didn't care is because he was my best friend and I loved him, and they were insulting him, not me anyway, and he was a beloved other, somebody I had a relationship with, except that I didn't, because Peter Timmins was my imaginary friend. So Peter Timmins was a beloved other that wasn't. Now, why I find that interesting, and you might think, what the hell has this got to do with intellectual humility? Bear with me a quick sec. What I had created is a self-distance as a way of seeing myself in a different light. I couldn't conceive of myself as a courageous 4-year-old, but I could conceive of somebody who could be courageous and who could help me. And by self-distancing a little bit, it allowed to function. Now, I'm not suggesting we all create imaginary friends, so I'm not quite that crazy. Now, in social psychology, Duke and Recross have done quite a bit of work, as have others, on self-distancing, if you like, after the fact, to reduce negative emotions, a way of stepping back from your thoughts and feelings about a situation, as a way of allowing you to reflect on it and look at it. I also do work in mindfulness meditation, and meditation is another example where you're stepping back, but in a more proactive way, in that it is for future circumstances often. So, for example, in mindfulness, you are watching your thoughts. And the reason you're watching your thoughts, you're trying not to let your attentional awareness run away with you, you're allowing them to come and to go. So I refer to this as having a central self with smaller satellites. So there's a centre of you, and your thoughts are like a satellite going around you. They are part of you, but they are not seen as the central aspects of you. You can watch them come and go, and that's perfectly okay. You also do the same with your emotions if you're particularly skilled at it. Again, watch them come and go, and you don't have to attach so strongly to it. And that this idea may allow for a stronger self that results where you know your limitations, but are not threatened by any information regarding your limitations of your knowledge. So if you allowed that knowledge to be more of a satellite. Now that may sound like a very odd thing to do, but what I'm looking at is in curriculum change with students this year, actually getting them to think of what they're learning as being slightly separate from themselves. So getting them to self-distance in class and to see if that actually helps their engagement and their openness. Because one of the things that self-distancing can allow is although momentarily I can let myself go and be in a moment, if I have these, my central self isn't being threatened, I can do that a lot more frequently in a lot more situations. And particularly for students, I'm hoping it can also help them to learn better. And I'm just about to, yeah?
No, I think there's no time.
Okay, well, I'll stop there and just say, if anybody thinks this is ridiculous, Peter Timmings is just outside the door. So please do tell him. Thank you.
A bit of a late start, and we have a longer break, so we can go just slightly over to 10:05, a limited this year, so we can entertain 10 minutes of questions. So, yes.
Vasudevi, Clare, that was very interesting. I have a question though. One thing that you began with Vasudevi had to do with the categorization, getting beyond that for individuals. And I'm trying to think a little bit as a social psychologist in that a lot of interaction between people is dependent on norms, and those norms themselves get in the way of what you're talking about, like norms of reciprocity. I mean, thinking about your circumstances at the beach, these people took you away with them, they were kind, they were hospitable. So what's driving me to be kind is not so much a lack of awareness of my own dislike of this particular place, but a norm of reciprocity, that I should return what I'm given. So the question is, how does the structure of social interaction itself, apart from my cognitive tendencies to put people in various bins, how does the structure of interaction itself, sort of undermine the kind of attention to the other directly? If I feel compelled to give back, to be equitable, to do a lot of things that grease the skids of interaction and define interaction models.
I think these are conflicts that we face all the time. So we hold different values, and values conflict, and it's kind of like it's a shit happens story of being with people. But the thing I think, there is something that we often forget about how perceptive other people can be of the truthfulness of our being in the situation. And you could get utterly absorbed with I've got to be polite and not be recognizing that the closeness of your face in saying, oh yeah, no, it was very good, thanks. I mean, and so on. So it's always, of course it is a balance, and of course you have to be conscious of these norms. But I think the thing that we forget more is how visible we are, and how that visibility is crucial for connection. So okay, it's like you have to make choices and you have to compromise, but...
And maybe that's why Claire, we didn't get visible.
And I'm totally controlled.
Please, yeah.
So humility, or important part of humility, is openness to engagement. It seems that that might suggest that introverted persons are far less likely to be humble than extroverted persons. And so sometimes I'm shopping, and it's the thing at the grocery store for the checkout person to be like, so, like, what are you doing this weekend? I'm like, I don't want to tell you, I'm just going to make something up, and I'm very not open because I don't want to be, and it's somebody who's extrovert, and I just tell their whole life story like they often do in front of me, and I'm waiting. So, what do you say about that?
I don't think, well, okay, I mean, yes, and we actually have what we were talking about in terms of the data with Louise. I don't think introverted people are less humble because they are not revealing themselves all the time. I think the interesting thing there is how the extent to, what do you want to talk about that? The extent to what you do, it's not so much just about revealing yourself,
I say, oh, so that's not even about repeating yourself, because I was thinking your extrovert is telling a story. They don't care who's there to listen to it. They're going to tell it. So they're not necessarily being open to the other at all, or even seeing the other as an I-thou relationship. It's just, oh, somebody to tell my story to. And so they're also not being sensitive to the context in which they're doing it either. So is that really being more open than you being honest about your lack of ability to be open in that moment?
It's kind of focusing on the connection. Yes, you are rejecting a particular opening for connection, which the other is offering you. But in doing that rejection, and in your honest way, the other could also make the effort to hear something is going on. It could lead to a better, a more sincere connection than I have to be open and I have to pretend to be jolly and gay and all that sort of stuff, right? Does that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it makes, so is it more of when you're engaging with somebody, you should be open rather than like the amount of times you do it, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, in a sense, you're bringing up a should question, and we actually had a slide at the end which we didn't bring up, because all of this about engagement and openness to engagement and about humility, they're both, about how you allow the other to be in this connection. It's something to do with allowing the person to be, right? Really be. Why should you do it? Why should we do that? Why is it important? Okay, if you've got God, that's fine. God tells you to be that way, or some particular aspect of religion tells you to do that way. But if you haven't got it, what is it that, why should you do it? So it's a should question you're asking.
Oh, no,
Okay?
sorry, and maybe it's not a should question. I'm just thinking, if somebody is in their room all the time because they like to read and they hardly ever engage, they could still be humble because whenever they do engage, they're very open. Would you say?
Yes.
That's true.
Yeah. But no, my answer to the should question, which I did have an answer, was that it is really about respect for emergence. It's regardless of religion, faith, and so on.
Actually, her question just made me think of another issue. Is there was this old theory, I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, I can't even remember the author of the theory. It's an old social psychological theory called social penetration theory. Do you remember whose theory that was? Anyway, the whole idea of it was kind of like, I think of it as like the tide theory of interpersonal relationships, where it's kind of like, the idea is that there's kind of times to connect with other people. That's kind of, I suppose, the social penetration phase. But then there's also the need for privacy to sort of, withdraw from other people, so to speak, and satisfy that need. And I think the whole idea behind social penetration theory is that there's a kind of, you need both of these in some kind of balance. That it's not like the solution to sort of the human condition is not to just always be interpersonally engaged, nor is it to sort of like always be in a condition of solitude, to kind of have this rhythm going back and
Yeah, I
forth.
mean, I don't know, I am really, really interested in that, in this, how we actually manage this balance between engagement and disengagement. Because even if you look at the Buber thing, he says explicitly, this I-thou thing, if you did it for more than a few seconds, you'd die. He doesn't put it as crudely as that, but then you can't,
What do you say?
you can't last for very long in an I-thou state of intense open relation. It has to shift at some point, usually sooner rather than later, into an I-it thing. And I think you're absolutely right, that we're kind of cycling in and out of engagement and disengagement all the time. I don't know how we do it, because sometimes I have a feeling that we do it simultaneously. I'm talking to you and I'm thinking, oh, I should be saying this, or, which is a kind of a reflection upon the engagement as well. And so I don't know whether it is simply a sequential rhythm. I think there is something more complex going on there that I don't know that we understand.
Just a follow-up to that, I think that in response to what Victor was saying, that I think engagement, in some sense, in order for it to have meaning, needs to be selective. That is, to the extent that engagement is wide open in every instance, in every encounter, engagement loses its meaning. And to some extent, not just a variation within a particular I-thou sequence, but more generally, not selective in the way one rejects others, but that one, in fact, saves their engagement. Let's say there's somewhat of a limit on the degree that we can invest. And if we're really investing in others, which is what you're suggesting, and investing away from the self, there has to be some sort of bank account of engagement resources that become important. So we selectively, I think we selectively.
Almost.
hydraulic, so a little bit hydraulic, you know?
No, I think there is a lot of, it comes also back to what you're saying, you know, you keep your openness for sometimes, some
Yeah.
people.
Well, we're out of time, and thank you for engaging. Talk.